In 1983, a widowed mother and her young son vanished without a trace from a remote vineyard in Sonoma County. 30 years later, a new family moves in, only to uncover chilling evidence buried beneath the floorboards. Unraveling a decades-old mystery the land was never meant to give up. The morning fog rolled in thick over the vineyard, curling around the gnarled vines like smoke. From the wraparound porch of the Dial farmhouse, Margot Dial stood barefoot, one hand wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee, the other resting against the cool porch railing. She watched the fog lift slowly from the rows of vines below. Her boy had always liked mornings like this. Adventure weather, he'd called it. Inside, the house was quiet. The radio in the kitchen played faint jazz, too soft to be a presence. A stack of old bills sat untouched by the sink. She turned from the fog and stepped back inside, calling gently, "Julian, you up?" No answer. She checked his room. The bed was unmade, but he wasn't in it. Just a heap of blankets, a stuffed raccoon near the edge, and the window cracked open slightly. Her chest tightened. "Julian," her voice sharpened. She moved through the house from hallway to back door, scanning the garden, the slope beyond. It wasn't unusual for him to wander outside before breakfast. He liked checking for toads near the well, but he always answered. Always. She stepped into the yard. The gate to the lower vineyard was open, swaying slightly. A cold knot formed in her stomach. He wasn't by the well. He wasn't in the garden. He wasn't on the swing. Margot walked faster, then ran. She called louder, again and again, her voice echoing down the slope. She searched the woods at the edge of their property. She checked the barn, the cellar, the creek behind the vineyard. Nothing. No sign of his footprints. No bicycle, no hat. By mid-afternoon, the sheriff's car was parked outside the farmhouse. Deputy Kramer was a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He jotted notes with a slow pen, standing on the porch as Margot clutched Julian's jacket to her chest. "He's never done this," she said, voice tight. "He doesn't wander off." The deputy nodded, not unkindly. "We'll organize a search," he said. "The woods around here go deep. Might have chased a rabbit. Got turned around. Kids do that." Margot wanted to scream, but she stayed still. Over the next 2 days, more deputies came. Volunteers from town showed up, flashlights in hand. They combed the property, drained the irrigation pond, circled the vineyard rows. They found no signs, not a footprint, not a scrap of fabric. A detective from Santa Rosa came up to question her. Margot repeated everything. She told them Julian had been anxious lately, that he said he'd seen someone near the barn at night, that she'd seen shadows herself. Once, a man standing by the trellis after sundown, gone when she called. Out. The detective wrote it down, but his expression never changed. By the 4th day, they suggested Julian may have wandered off and not survived. Margot didn't believe it. She didn't care what the search dogs didn't find. She knew he didn't leave by choice. Weeks passed. The search ended. The volunteers stopped coming. The vineyard stood still in the fall sun, slowly wilting with the season. The grapes were left on the vine. Margot couldn't bring herself to harvest. She barely left the house. Each day, she wandered the property, following paths, retracing steps, calling into the trees like it still made sense. She began sleeping. Downstairs near the kitchen, she set chairs against the doors. At night, she kept a fireplace poker by the bed. In town, people began to whisper, "The widow's not well." She wrote in her journal, entries not about grief, but suspicion. She noted a pair of rusty footprints that led up to the kitchen window one morning after rain. She wrote about the man her son said was watching him, about Arthur. Arthur Emmons hadn't returned to the vineyard since Julian's disappearance. He had been Jean's business partner, practically family, for years. But something in him had changed since Jean's death. He'd fought hard to keep his share of the operation. Even after the will made it clear it was all Margot's, he'd left bitter. But maybe he hadn't left at all. 2 months to the day after Julian vanished, Margot Dial stopped answering her phone. A neighbor noticed her mailbox filling up. The delivery driver saw groceries left on the porch from 4 days earlier. The sheriff was called. Deputy Kramer returned, this time with a second car. They entered through the back. The house was undisturbed. Her purse was on the table, keys inside, coffee cup half full in the sink, the back door locked from the inside. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no goodbye note. She was simply gone. The investigation fizzled. Another missing person. Another cold file. Rumors flew. Some said she'd broken down and wandered into the woods, unable to face losing Julian. Others whispered darker things, that someone had taken her too. That the vineyard had a curse. The land sat untouched for nearly a year. Arthur Emmons, one of the shareholders wanting to keep the estate alive, filed for a claim of the estate. A probate judge approved the transfer. Arthur took over operations by late 1984. He kept a skeleton crew, renamed the label Dial Emmons Reserve, though few locals would touch it. Over time the vine suffered, orders declined. He tried to automate some of the process. It didn't help. By the early 1990s, the vineyard's reputation had eroded. Arthur stopped bottling altogether. The farmhouse windows stayed dark. The hills fell silent again. By 2000, the vineyard was overgrown. The once pristine rows of vines were choked by weeds. The cellar had flooded once and never been repaired. Paint peeled from the house, shutters swung loose. Stray animals lived in the barn. Locals passed by on the road and turned their heads. In 2014, the land went on the market, listed quietly at a bargain price. The listing sparse and unassuming. No mention of history. No mention of the family who once called it home. Just 10 acres, needs work. Price negotiable. The truck's tires crunched over the gravel driveway, kicking up a thin trail of dust as the Rhodes family pulled into the neglected heart of the Dial vineyard. Sarah Rhodes leaned forward in the passenger seat, squinting through the windshield at the sprawling farmhouse, its cracked shutters rattling softly in the breeze. The vines surrounding the house were skeletal and tangled, creeping like brittle fingers up from the soil. Looks worse in person, Callum said, forcing a light laugh as he turned off the engine. Sarah didn't respond. She opened her door slowly and stepped out, the late spring air thick with the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. Sophie climbed out from the back seat, a stuffed animal clutched under her arm. "Mom," Sophie whispered, "is this it?" "This is it," Sarah said, her voice flat but not unkind. "Our new home." Callum stood behind her, running a hand through his hair. "A little cleanup, a lot of paint. It'll feel like ours in no time." Sarah offered a small nod, though her expression didn't match his optimism. She walked toward the porch, the wood creaking beneath her boots. The front door opened with a long groan. Inside, the house was darker than expected. A lingering mildew scent hung in the air, woven into the wood. The rooms were shadowed. Furniture draped in white sheets. Dust thick enough to write in covered every surface. A cracked portrait hung crooked in the hall, 2 people in outdated clothing, their features faded by time and sunlight. Sarah turned it face down without a word. Over the next few weeks, the family adjusted to their new rhythm. Callum arranged for contractors to start on the outbuildings, while Sarah focused on cleaning and taking inventory of the house. Sophie wandered the property in quiet curiosity, often with a sketchpad in hand. The 3 of them ate breakfast at a makeshift table in the dining room, surrounded by cardboard boxes and tools. Callum, freshly unburdened from his years of running a software firm, tried to be present. He made lunch. He offered to fix things he didn't know how to fix. Sarah appreciated the effort, but noticed how quickly he returned to checking emails. Marriage was not broken, but bruised, made thin from years of side conversations and missed dinners. She hoped this place, in its silence and seclusion, might give them space to repair the fracture. One afternoon, Sarah passed by Sophie's room and saw her daughter hunched over the floor, coloring. She paused in the doorway. "What you working on?" Sophie held up a page. A boy stood in a window, peeking through curtains. The lines were dense and precise, the face oddly solemn. "Is that someone you saw?" Sophie nodded. "His name's Julian. He lives here." Sarah crouched beside her, trying not to let her face register concern. "You mean like in your imagination?" "No, he's a real boy. He talks to me when you're busy." Sophie glanced toward the hallway. "He says his mom's sad." Sarah tried to smile. "Well, if Julian comes back, you tell him dinner's at 6. Renovation started in the kitchen. The floor was uneven and partially rotted, with subfloor beams showing through in places. Sarah had insisted they start there. It felt symbolic somehow. Fix the foundation first. On a bright Saturday morning, Sarah was unpacking glassware when she heard the sharp crack of wood splitting. Then Sophie's scream. She bolted into the kitchen and saw it. The floor had caved in beneath the window. A narrow hole exposed a dark space beneath the house. Callum was already crouched at the edge, reaching down. I've got her. Sophie, hold on." Sarah dropped to her knees. Sophie's voice echoed from below, panicked but unhurt. "I can't move. Something's next to me." "Don't look," Sarah said, already dialing 911. By the time emergency responders arrived, Callum had pulled Sophie out with minor scrapes and bruises. But what lay beneath the floor wasn't just an old crawl space. It was sealed cement, partially fractured by time. And lodged within the cemented cavity was a form compact, twisted, and unmistakably human. Within hours, the sheriff's department had secured the kitchen. Crime scene tape stretched across doorways, fluttering in the draft from the broken floor. Forensic techs came and went in boot covers, their voices low and efficient. Sarah stood at the edge of the living room, arms crossed tightly, watching the scene through the doorframe. Callum paced the hallway with his hands in his pockets, occasionally glancing at the floor like he might fall through. Sophie, wrapped in a blanket, sat silently on the couch beside a neighbor who had come over to help. Deputy Elaine Barron joined Sarah near the front door. She spoke quietly, but without sugarcoating. "They found a skeleton," she said. "Adult female, based on initial markers. No identification yet." Sarah swallowed hard. "How long has it been there?" Barron shook her head. "Too early to say. The crawl space was sealed thoroughly. It'll take the lab a few days to run age estimates, dental records, and other comparisons." The call came 4 days later, just before dusk. Sarah was standing at the edge of the vineyard, staring at the rows of brittle vines when her phone rang. She answered on instinct, already knowing who it would be. Barron's voice came through, clear but careful. "It's Margot Dial," she said. "Dental records confirmed it this afternoon." Sarah said nothing at first. The wind pushed lightly at her hair. "She disappeared in the early to mid-1980s. We're now treating this as a homicide," Barron added. "We're reopening the case." Did Sophie accidentally expose a secret that was meant to be buried forever? What really happened to the Dials 30 years ago? With Margot's disappearance now being treated as a homicide, who deserves the most suspicion? The next morning, Sarah waited until Sophie was settled with her sketchpad and Callum had retreated to a call in the den before quietly opening her laptop. The glow lit up the kitchen, still half gutted from the renovation pause. Drywall stacked against one wall, sawdust faintly coating the table. She searched. Margot Dial Disappearance, 1983, Sonoma County. Dozens of hits populated, mostly forum speculation and one local newspaper's digital archive. She clicked through links, obituaries, missing person reports, old photos scanned poorly. Then she found it, a 3-paragraph article dated August 19, 1983, from the Santa Rosa Daily Ledger. The headline was simple: "Boy presumed drowned after Vineyard disappearance." Julian's name appeared only once. No mention of evidence, no confirmation. Just a quote from the sheriff's department noting that the irrigation pond and surrounding terrain were thoroughly searched. And the child was believed to have drowned. Sarah stared at the screen, disturbed by how easy it had been to bury a person in one paragraph. Later that afternoon, Sarah left Callum with Sophie and drove alone into town. The Sonoma County Historical Archive was wedged between a bakery and a frame shop, its door warped from rain, bell jingling faintly as she stepped in. A volunteer greeted her, offered access to the microfiche reader, and left her alone in the dim archive room. She pulled the drawer for 1983 and began scanning frame by frame. After half an hour, she paused. A grainy black and white image filled the reader screen. A photo from Dial Hill Vineyard's Harvest Festival, taken just months before Zhang Dial's death. Margot stood near a tasting table, smiling nervously into the camera. Beside her was Zhang, holding Julian on his hip, and to Jean's right stood a man, shorter, wiry, hair swept back from a receding hairline. His hand rested lightly on Julian's shoulder. Arthur Emmons, the same person who put the place up for sale. She printed the photo and slipped it into her bag. The next stop was 3 blocks away. A faded green bungalow with lace curtains and a tidy yard of rosemary and potted geraniums. Sarah rang the bell, photo tucked in her back pocket. Mildred Habersham, late 70s and sharper than she looked, opened the door with a wary smile. "Yes, I'm Sarah Rhodes. My family just bought the Dial property." Mildred hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You're the ones who found her." Sarah swallowed. "Yes, I'm trying to understand what happened." Mildred let her in without another word. They sat in the sunroom. The older woman poured lukewarm tea and adjusted her sweater. "Margot wasn't crazy," Mildred said. "People thought she was. Started talking about noises, people watching her. But she was scared." "I saw it," Sarah leaned in. "Did she say who she thought was watching her?" "She never named him, but she showed up on my porch one night in July, just after sunset. Said someone had been walking near the trellis. Julian had seen him too. She begged me to go to the sheriff with her. I told her to come back the next day, and we'd go together. She never showed." Sarah's hands tightened around her mug. "I thought maybe she'd just come unstitched, you know." Mildred's voice dropped. "But now I think someone wanted her gone." Sarah pulled the folded photo from her coat. "Do you recognize him?" Mildred's eyes flicked to Arthur's face. Her breath hitched. That was their business partner, Arthur. They used to run the vineyard together. After the Dials were gone, he took over. Can't say he did a good job with the place, though. That evening, Sarah walked the vineyard alone. The sun hung low over the valley, casting long golden shadows. Over the tangled rows, she stepped carefully along the cracked pathway toward the barn, which leaned slightly to one side, its roof sun-bleached and sagging. Inside, the air smelled of rust and soil. The place had clearly been used for storage: old crates, broken tools, empty wine racks covered in cobwebs. In the far corner, beneath a pile of rotted sacks and cracked terracotta pots, something glinted. She crouched and brushed the dirt aside. Half buried in the packed earth was a rusted chain, and at the end of it, a small pendant. She turned it over. The engraving was faded but still legible. G. Julian Dial. She knelt for a long time, staring at the object. The dirt around it seemed untouched. No claw marks, no indication that animals had disturbed it. Someone had dropped this. She sealed it in a paper bag and returned to the house. The sheriff's office was quiet the next morning when she walked Deputy Barron met her in the lobby and took her into a side office. Sarah placed the bag on the table and explained where she found the pendant. Barron examined it with care, then gave a slow exhale. "It's compelling," she said, "but not conclusive. We can't prove when or how it got there." Sarah's frustration bubbled beneath the surface. It belonged to the boy who went missing. It was found 20 feet from where he was last seen. "I believe you," Barron said, "but belief doesn't build a case." Not 30 years later, Sarah left with the pendant still in the evidence bag, unsatisfied, but not defeated. Air in the county records office was dry, filtered through vents that hadn't been cleaned in a decade. Sarah stood at the counter. The clerk, a balding man in his 50s, slowly flipped through a manila folder she'd requested. It was the official case file for Julian Dial, who died in 1982. "Here's what we've got," the clerk said, sliding the folder toward her. Most of it's standard autopsy summary, witness statement. Though I'll warn you, this copy isn't complete. Some pages are missing. Sarah opened it immediately, flipping to the coroner's report. She stopped midway. "Where's the diagram?" she asked. "The body chart? The external injuries?" He leaned over, peering at the folder. "Hard to say. Could have been misfiled back in the day. Most of this was transferred from paper in the 90s. Some stuff got lost." Sarah frowned, scanning what little remained. The conclusion simply read, "Cause of death, blunt force trauma consistent with accidental fall. No external lacerations or evidence of assault. Case closed." But something felt off. The language was vague, careful, as if someone had been told not to speculate beyond the bare minimum. She thanked the clerk, took the copy, and stepped back into the sun. The address wasn't far, a modest ranch home on the edge of downtown with a flagpole in the yard and a cracked stone path. Sarah rang the doorbell twice. A woman in her 60s opened the door. She wore glasses and a knitted shawl. "You must be Sarah," she said. "I'm Elaine Kramer. Come in." The living room was a time capsule of early 2000s furniture and faded photographs. Elaine gestured to a cedar chest under the window. "My father kept things," she said. "Didn't trust the system to remember." Sarah knelt and opened the lid. Inside were old notepads, folders, and labeled envelopes. She found a file marked Dial Case, 1982, 1983. "I remember this," Elaine said. "He talked about it more than once. Said it didn't sit right. Julian Dial's death, the kid going missing, then the mother, all in a year. Too much coincidence." Sarah thumbed through the pages. One note jumped out. "Bruising on back of head inconsistent with single-point fall. Entry wound shallow. No indication of forward momentum. Pattern suggests backward force or strike." She looked up. "Did he ever mention suspects?" Elaine shook her head. "He had theories, but nothing he could prove. I think that's what haunted him most. He knew something had happened, but nobody wanted to dig." Sarah held the paper in her hands a moment longer before carefully tucking it into her bag. Back at the house, Callum was in the kitchen organizing invoices from the contractors. Sarah laid the folder on the table and took a breath. "There's more to Jean's death than a fall," she said. "The autopsy was scrubbed. The original detective, he suspected it too. Look." She opened the file, pointing to the diagram and notes. Callum scanned it briefly, then leaned back, arms crossed. "Sarah, we're not detectives. We moved here to start fresh, not dig up graves. This isn't just about curiosity," she sighed. "Julian didn't drown. Margot didn't vanish. Jean didn't just slip. There's a pattern here." He sighed, rubbing his temple. "And what are you going to do with it? March into the sheriff's office and say the Vineyard is cursed?" "It's not about curses," she snapped. "It's about someone getting away with murder." Callum looked at her hard, then softened. "I get it. I do. But maybe it's Time to let the police handle it. We've got Sophie to think about." She didn't respond. Not because he was right, but because she could already feel how much he wanted this to go away. The wind picked up that night. The trees behind the vineyard rattled, branches scraping against each other like old bones. Sarah lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Beside her, Callum was already asleep, one hand resting over his stomach, breaths even. It was just after 2 a.m. when she heard the creak of the floorboards down the hall. She sat up, immediately alert. Then a soft voice called out, "Mom!" She rushed down the hallway and found Sophie standing barefoot, eyes wide with tears. "What is it?" Sarah asked, kneeling down. "I saw him again," Sophie whispered. "Julian." Sarah pulled her close. "It was just a dream." "No," Sophie shook her head. "He was crying. He said he couldn't breathe. He said he was stuck and the air was gone." Sarah felt her arms go rigid. "I tried to help him," Sophie said, voice cracking, "but I couldn't move. He kept saying, 'Please, please don't. Leave me here.'" Sarah sat with her daughter on the hallway floor, holding her tightly. The house around them groaned in the wind, as if remembering something. The heater in Sophie's room had started rattling again. It wasn't loud, just an intermittent clicking sound that came and went with the wind, but it was enough to keep her up that night. Sophie pulled her blanket tight, eyes adjusting to the dark. Something about the vent had been bothering her lately, and not just the noise. It felt off. She slid out of bed, barefoot, crept across the cold floor, and knelt by the wall. Carefully she reached toward the vent. Her fingers brushed metal and dust. Then paper. A folded page was wedged between the vent slats. She hesitated, then tugged gently until it slipped out. The paper was yellowed and brittle at the edges, the ink faint but still legible. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, squinting. As she read, "If you're reading this, I don't know what's happened to me, but I fear the worst. Jean did not fall. He was pushed. Someone tried to silence Julian. They will come for me too. If I disappear, it was not by choice. Please believe that." The signature was unmistakable. Margot Dial. Sophie clutched the note and ran. Sarah was in the kitchen when Sophie burst in, barefoot, hair tangled, eyes wide. "Mom," she whispered, "I found something." Sophie held out the note with 2 hands. Sarah blinked as she took it, brushing off the dust. As her eyes moved down the page, her breath caught. The words were disjointed, as if Margot had written in fear, in a hurry. Yet they were deliberate. A mother trying to protect her child. A woman who knew she was in danger. Callum wasn't home. Out for a drive to clear his head. Maybe that was for the best. "She says Jane was murdered," Sarah murmured, her thumb tracing Margot's shaky handwriting. "She says someone tried to hurt Julian and that she knew someone was going to come for her too." Sophie pointed to a sentence near the bottom. "Look there." She hid her journal. "In the house. I've hidden the rest in the bones of this house." Sarah's fingers tightened around the page. The house had always creaked with secrets, but now it whispered them more urgently. Sarah spent the rest of the day searching, removing baseboards, tapping panels, shining a flashlight under the stairs. Every groan of the floorboards, every hollow knock behind the drywall, filled her with anticipation and dread. There was no journal, not yet. In the hallway upstairs, she pried open a wall panel behind an old linen closet and found nothing but insulation. In the crawl space beneath the stairs, she pulled aside a heap of rotting fabric and mouse nests, but the only thing waiting there was dust. Sophie stayed close, offering quiet suggestions. Try under the floorboards. Or what about inside the attic beams? It struck Sarah how calm her daughter had become, not frightened, but somehow connected to the mystery. "I think Julian wants us to find it," Sophie said, matter of fact. "He's helping." Sarah didn't know what to say to that, but she didn't argue. That evening, Sarah called Sheriff Baird. She told him about the note. He sounded weary. If it's not dated or signed in front of someone, it's not much more than hearsay, he said. You'd be surprised how often these stories bubble up when properties change hands. Grief, imagination, it all leaves a mark. She predicted her own death, Sarah pressed. She said if she went missing, it wasn't voluntary. She said someone tried to hurt her son. I'll file it, Mrs. Rhodes, Baird replied, but I can't reopen an investigation on a hunch. Sarah hung up. Her hands were trembling, but not with fear, with determination. She walked back into the hallway where the baseboard was still pried up. Somewhere inside these walls, Margot had hidden the truth. Maybe the law wouldn't dig, but she would doubt it was nearly midnight when Sarah shut the crawl space door. She had spent another day pulling apart corners of the house and attic, but still hadn't found Margot's journal. Her fingers were raw from prying nails and splinters. She sat at the kitchen table, flipping through photocopies of newspaper, clippings and deed transfers, her eyes tracing names like she was memorizing them. One name had surfaced twice, a Vineyard worker listed in a 1982 Community Fair article and again in a shipment invoice from 1983 Eduardo Lobo. The next morning, she called the clerk's office, then the local union. It took hours, but someone finally connected her to a small home in Petaluma. She drove the hour and knocked on the rusted gate. An older man answered, lean and sun-browned, his white hair tucked under a faded baseball cap. He eyed her with suspicion. Eduardo. Lobo, Sarah said. I think you used to work at Dial Hill. I did, he said slowly. That was a long time ago. I'm not here to stir trouble, she assured him. But I think you might be the only person left who knows what happened to Margot Dial. That made him hesitate. He opened the gate. They sat on a shaded porch surrounded by tomato plants and wind chimes. Eduardo poured her iced tea and sat across from her, hands folded. You said you bought the vineyard? Yes, my family and I moved in a few months ago. My daughter found something. It led us to a sealed crawl space. Margot's body was in it. He lowered his eyes. I knew this day would come. Sarah waited. I was a young man then, quiet, did what I was told. He looked past her at nothing. Jean was a good man. Treated everyone with respect. Arthur, though, he was always watching, like he was waiting for people to slip up. Sarah leaned in. Do you believe Arthur had anything to do with the Dial cases? Eduardo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into a side drawer on the porch and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was a photograph of the Vineyard staff from 1982. Sarah recognized Margot's bright smile. Jing stood beside her. Eduardo was in the back row. Arthur, off to the side, barely smiling. I didn't see it with my own eyes, Eduardo finally said, but I know what Margot told me. She said Zhang was pushed. Julian saw it happen. Sarah's breath caught. He saw it? Eduardo nodded slowly. Julian was only a boy, but he knew something. After Zhang died, Margot told me she was scared. She said someone had tried to get into the house one night. She heard footsteps outside his window. Did she say she'd gone to the police? She planned to, but she never got the chance. Sarah sat back, stunned. Why didn't you say anything? I had 2 kids and a wife depending on me, Eduardo said quietly. Arthur paid well, and he had a temper. I saw what he did to a contractor once for showing up late. I thought if I spoke up, maybe I'd disappear too. The guilt in his voice was unmistakable. I've lived with that silence a long time, but when I read she was found, something lifted. Sarah reached out, placing a hand gently over his. Thank you for telling me. He looked up, eyes sharp for the first time. Be careful, Mrs. Rhodes. Arthur is still out there, and if he thinks you're getting too close, he won't stay quiet. Sarah parked on the sun-bleached gravel outside Verona Cafe, her fingers clenched tightly around the steering wheel. Through the cafe window, she spotted Arthur Emmons, alone at a small round table in the corner, sipping his espresso like he owned the whole town. He hadn't aged much. A few more lines around the eyes, a bit more silver in his hair, but the same smug air still clung to him. She stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled. Arthur looked up, smiled with vague politeness, then froze when he recognized her. "I was hoping I'd run into you," Sarah said. Arthur gave a thin-lipped smile. Sarah Rhodes, or should I say Dial's newest ghost hunter. She didn't sit. "I found Margot's journal, or at least pages of it." She knew Zhang didn't. "Fall. She knew you were behind it." Arthur's face didn't move. His eyes narrowed just slightly. "You found pages. Must have been quite the scavenger hunt." "There's more. The pendant, Eduardo Lobo, and the autopsy. Where did the missing pages go?" Arthur reached slowly for his coffee, took a measured sip, then set the cup down with deliberate care. "You're chasing ghosts, Mrs. Rhodes. Zhang and I were partners. Why would I kill him? Because you wanted the vineyard for yourself. Because Margot was going to tell someone." He stood, smoothing his jacket, his face still calm, but eyes hard. "You have no idea what you're meddling in. You bought the land. Do something with it. The past is meant to be forgotten." He walked past her, leaving a faint trace of cologne and unease in his wake. That night, Sarah lay beside Callum, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked in its usual places, the wind brushing the eaves like fingertips. But something felt off. Her body wouldn't relax. Her mind wouldn't stop spinning. She must have finally drifted off because the crash hit like thunderglass splintering. A hollow thump, and Sophie screamed from across the hall. Callum was already out of bed, Sarah seconds behind. In the hallway, they nearly collided. "My window," Sophie cried. There was a man. They rushed into her room. Glass glittered across the hardwood floor, and a brick sat nestled in the broken remains of the window pane. Sarah's pulse thudded in her throat. "Are you hurt?" she asked, kneeling beside Sophie. "No," the girl whimpered. "But he was there. I saw him in the dark." Callum called the sheriff. Sarah found a folded piece of paper tied to the brick with twine, one sentence, typed and taped to the side. "Dig too deep and you'll get buried." The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, took statements, swept a flashlight over the yard, and promised a patrol car would pass by more often. "Could be a prank," he muttered. "Teenagers, someone trying to scare the new owners." Sarah showed him the note. He shrugged. "Not much to go on. We'll look into it." She didn't believe he would. Not really. The next morning, Sarah brewed her coffee and stood by the window, staring at the vineyard bathed in golden fog. Sophie was quiet at breakfast, and Callum barely looked at her. He still thought she was overreacting. While Sophie played. In the living room, Sarah returned to the attic. She couldn't shake the feeling Margot had hidden more. If she wrote about hiding the journal in the bones of the house, there had to be more than just that single page. She opened the chimney access panel again. Dust puffed into her face. Her flashlight's beam caught an odd seam in the brickwork, one that looked newer, less worn. She pried gently with the claw of a hammer. A brick shifted. Behind it, a small iron lockbox. She lifted it out, coughing as the dust filled her lungs. It was cold, heavier than she expected. There was no keyhole, just a heavy latch, rusted but intact. Back downstairs, she wrapped it in a towel and slid it under her bed. Callum wouldn't understand. She had come too far to stop now. Sarah waited until morning. The attic air had been thick with dust and suspicion when she found the box wedged behind a loose brick near the chimney throat. Now sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea that had long gone cold, she slid the lid off. Inside, a stack of yellowed pages bound with a faded ribbon, and beneath them, a small black tape recorder with an old cassette still loaded. Margot's name was written in delicate cursive on the label. Sarah's hands trembled as she pressed play. The static cleared. Then Margot's voice filled the room, soft, brittle, yet strangely calm. "If you're hearing this, I didn't make it," she began. "Zhang didn't fall. Arthur pushed him. It was about the vineyard, control, money. But more than that, jealousy. Zhang had the name, the family. Arthur wanted to take it all." Sarah leaned in closer. The voice continued. "Julian saw. He saw Arthur on the hill that morning. The shovel, the blood. He didn't understand what he saw, but I did. And now Arthur's watching us, following us after sundown. I'm afraid. For my son, for myself." Margot's voice cracked. "I am going to the sheriff. I am going to tell everything. I've hidden copies of this journal, somewhere no one would think to look." The tape clicked off. Sarah sat frozen, eyes wide, hand clamped over her mouth. It was no longer theory, no longer rumor. Margot had known, and she died for it. Flashback, October 1983. Twilight had settled over Dial Hill like a curtain. Margot stepped out of the farmhouse, wrapped in her knit shawl, a flashlight tucked under her arm, and her keys clutched tightly in one hand. Julian had been gone for 2 months. The grief still sat raw and screaming beneath the surface. But tonight, Margot felt sharp, certain. The sheriff would believe her this time. She had written everything down, and tonight she would leave a copy at the station doorstep if she had to. She crossed the gravel yard, heart hammering, when a shape lunged from the shadows. A heavy blow struck the side of her head. She dropped. Arthur Emmons stood over her, face half lit in the porch light's edge. No emotion, just method. He dragged her limp body across the yard toward the bottling cellar, an old stone structure partially sunk into the hillside. The iron latch screeched as he opened it. Inside, cool, damp air waited like a tomb. Arthur hauled her down the narrow steps, set her against the far wall, and stepped back. His breathing was ragged. A pail of mortar and a stack of stones were already waiting, prepared. He began, one stone at a time, layering the wall, sealing her in. Margot stirred once, groggy. She whispered something he didn't hear, then coughed, then nothing. Arthur laid the final stone and smoothed the cement. By morning, the cellar looked untouched. Present day. Sarah collapsed into the armchair, journal clutched to her chest. The shock of the confession, the brutality of the recording, it was too much to absorb at once. She stared blankly at the window, the vineyard beyond cast in early gold. Sophie tiptoed into the room, sensing the weight in her mother's stillness. "Are you okay?" she asked, eyes wide. Sarah blinked, nodded slowly. "I'm okay, sweetie. I just found something important." She didn't go into detail. Instead, after tucking Sophie into bed, Sarah made 3 copies, 2 digital, 1 printed. She handed the envelope to Callum that evening. "If something happens," she said plainly, "take this straight to the sheriff. Don't wait." Callum looked alarmed. "Sarah, what's going on?" "Just promise me." He agreed reluctantly, pocketing the sealed envelope. That afternoon, Sarah felt herself breathe for the first time in weeks. Sophie had begged to go walking among the vines, just the 2 of them. The sun was warm, the leaves rustling gently overhead, and for a moment, the land felt peaceful. They walked side by side, Sophie skipping ahead occasionally to collect bits of wild mint and flowers. "Do you think Julian liked mint?" she asked suddenly. Sarah gave a small smile. "I think he did." That's when she heard it. The rustle. Too heavy to be a bird, too slow to be wind. She turned just in time to see the figure behind her. Arthur, dirt-streaked, eyes wild, mouth pressed in a flat line. He moved fast, a cloth over her mouth, chemical sting. Sarah dropped, the sky spinning. Sophie was next. Arthur grabbed them. Then nothing. Callum returned just after 4. The paper bag of groceries swung from his wrist, car keys still in hand. The house was quiet, too quiet. He set the bag down on the counter, "Sarah," he called. "Sophie." He walked through the rooms, noting the untouched mugs on the kitchen table, the open back door, the jacket Sarah always wore still hanging by the stairs. A chill worked its way through his spine. He checked the barn, the Vineyard trail. Nothing. Then he called her cell. No answer. "Sophie," he shouted now, voice breaking into panic. He checked her room. The bed was still made. The heater vent from earlier still ajar. 15 minutes later, he was on the phone with the sheriff. An hour after that, deputies were combing the land with dogs, flashlights, and helicopters. The Dial property, once again, was the center of the search. Just like in 1983, Sarah's wrists throbbed against the nylon ties digging into her skin. The inside of the cabin was stale with dust and sweat, and only a single lantern lit the dim space. Sophie sat curled beside her, eyes swollen, hands gripping her mother's pant leg. Arthur paced near the window, every other step cracking the warped floorboards. "You had no right to dig it all back up," he muttered. It was done. Buried. Sarah swallowed the dry taste in her mouth. "You don't have to do this." He stopped and turned to her slowly. "Where's the tape? The journal?" "You're too late," Sarah said. "Callum has them. He's already gone to the sheriff." A vein in Arthur's temple twitched. "You're lying." "I'm not." His fingers twitched as if ready to strike, but didn't. Instead, he turned his back, breathing hard. It should have ended back then if Margot had just kept her mouth shut. "She didn't," Sarah cut in, voice firm despite the ache in her ribs. "And you're not going to get away with it this time." Arthur's head turned sharply toward Sophie. "And you?" "What did you say the boy's name was?" Sophie whispered. "Julian." He crouched beside her. "Julian's dead." "He doesn't talk," Sophie trembled. "He said you hurt him." Arthur's hand hovered in the air, as if he didn't know whether to strike or recoil. He stood abruptly and walked to the door. His composure was thinning. At the sheriff's office, Callum paced, clutching the envelope Sarah had given him. He had already handed over the tape and journal. Officers scoured maps, reviewing nearby properties. The wind had shifted slightly. Someone reported seeing smoke east of the ridge. "Cabin out in Four Pines," said Deputy Lauren. "Old hunting lodge from the 70s. Nothing there but one dirt road and trees." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Send the chopper. Quiet. We don't spook him." By dawn they had eyes on the cabin. Arthur lit the stove for warmth just after sunrise, smoke curling lazily from the metal chimney pipe. He didn't notice the faint crunch of boots in the surrounding woods. Didn't notice the line of officers encircling the cabin like wolves closing in. Then the knock came. "Arthur Emmons, this is Sheriff Calhoun. Step outside slowly." Arthur froze. Sarah sat up sharply. Sophie clutched her again. "I've got a child in here," Arthur shouted, dragging Sophie to her feet. "You want her safe? You back off." The door creaked open, and Arthur stepped into the doorway. Sophie's small frame pressed against him, his arm wrapped across her chest. "One move and she dies," he bellowed. "No one has to get hurt," the sheriff called back. "You don't want to make this worse." Arthur's hand shook slightly. Inside, Sarah wriggled her arms against the binding. Her eyes landed on the cast iron pan left on the floor. "Arthur," she called, voice quiet. "You've already lost. Let her go." "I gave everything to that land," he shouted, and he tossed me aside like nothing. He was unraveling now. His grip on Sophie loosened. That was all Sarah needed. She sprang up from behind him, hurling her weight into his lower back. Arthur staggered forward. Sophie twisted free and bolted. Officers surged. One slammed Arthur to the ground as others pulled Sarah back and covered Sophie with their bodies. It was over in seconds. In the sterile light of the interrogation room, Arthur Emmons sat slouched in the chair, wrists cuffed to the bolted table. His eyes were vacant now. He looked older than he had the day before. He never saw me coming. He began, almost whispering. Zhang, we were clearing the slope near the west edge. He made some remark about Margot wanting to convert the barn into a gallery or something ridiculous like that. Said I'd be paid out, not a partner, just severance. After all those years, he swallowed. I followed him down the hill. He stopped to check the soil line near the retaining wall. That's when I had the shovel in hand already. One swing, it was done. He paused, looked up at the mirror on the wall. Didn't see the boy at first, hiding behind the vines. I thought he wouldn't say anything. Eventually, he cracked and told his mommy. She had to be silenced too. She knew too much. He leaned back. You don't bury things like that. They claw back up. Using Arthur's crude directions, officers returned to the vineyard slope, just behind the trellises near the eastern wall. It didn't take long. The earth was disturbed, the soil lighter, and beneath a shallow mound of stone and roots, they found what they had never found in 1983. Julian Dial, his remains still clothed in a child's corduroy jacket, a rusted belt, buckle shaped like a bear, and one muddy sneaker. Sarah stood silently by as they carried the remains up the hill. Callum wrapped his arm around her shoulder. They can rest now, he said. She nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on the vineyard where the past had refused to stay buried. And finally, after decades of silence, had spoken. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back row, there. Cameras lowered as the judge delivered the sentence. Arthur Emmons sat motionless in his chair, flanked by deputies. He wore the same blank expression he'd had during the entire trial. Unmoved, unrepentant, the court finds the defendant guilty. Of the following charges, the judge began, his voice heavy. The murder of Jane Dial, the murder of Margot Dial, the murder of Julian Dial, the kidnapping and attempted murder of Sarah Rhodes and her minor child Sophie Rhodes. A murmur passed through the gallery. For these crimes, the judge continued, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Arthur's eyes flicked toward Sarah just once. She didn't blink. Callum reached for her hand. Later, as Arthur was led away, the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was something else, the slow exhale of a vineyard holding its breath. For 40 years, it was early spring when the vineyard came alive again. Rows of vines, once choked with neglect, were pruned and thriving under Callum's careful eye. The barn, preserved, not renovated, stood as it had in the old photos, its beams patched but unchanged. Sophie had taken to calling it Julian's barn. No one corrected her. The memorial was held on a quiet Sunday. Under the oldest oak tree at the top of the slope, a small crowd gathered, community members, vineyard hands from decades past, journalists with notepads tucked in their pockets. Even Sheriff Calhoun attended, his hat in his hands. The plaque was simple. In memory of Zhang, Margot, and Julian Dial, beloved family taken too soon. Remembered always. Sarah stepped back as Sophie approached, holding something close to her chest. It was a drawing, 3 figures, a man, a woman, and a boy with a swing behind them. She placed it gently at the base of the stone, then stepped back, lips barely moving. I hope you're in a better place, Julian, she whispered. A breeze stirred through the trees. The crowd stood in silence. That summer, the vineyard reopened, not with press releases or launch events, but with a single label elegantly embossed. Deep green glass glinting in the light. Dial 1983 Reserve. It's their story, Sarah said. We're just giving it an ending. Bottles sold faster than expected, but Sarah didn't care about profits. Each label carried a note tucked. Behind the foil, a brief history of the Dials, their vision, and their legacy. No mention of tragedy, just love and land. Late one afternoon, Sarah walked the vineyard rows with Sophie. The air was warm, the earth damp beneath their boots. Sophie ran ahead, arms out, brushing fingertips across the leaves. Sunlight poured in streams through the vines. The barn sat in the distance, washed in golden light, its open doors casting long shadows. Sarah paused near the trellis line and looked back. Callum stood at the top of the hill, hands in his pockets, watching them. She smiled and waved him over. When he reached her, she leaned into his chest. He wrapped his arms around her quietly, just breathing. "I didn't think we'd get here." Sarah said. "You did," Callum replied, "even when I didn't." They stood for a moment longer, listening to Sophie's laughter echo through the vines. Sarah reached out and touched a nearby stalk, its tendrils climbing steadily. "We'll finish what they started," she said. Callum nodded, his hand covering hers. "And we'll do it right." That evening, Sarah sat alone in the study, the old Dial journal open on her lap. A fire crackled softly in the hearth. She wasn't reading anymore, just turning pages slowly. Margot's handwriting felt like a voice across time. She had feared. So much feared for her son, for the truth, for her family's legacy. But she had still chosen to write it all down, to hope someone would someday listen. She got up, walked quietly to Sophie's room, and peeked inside. The girl was fast asleep, curled around her stuffed dog. Sarah closed the door and went downstairs. Outside, the vines whispered in the wind, and the oak tree stood tall at the edge of the field, its branches wide, its roots deep. For the first time since they moved in, the house felt like home.